Okay, so you want to own a cargo shipping line. Massive steel vessels the length of 4 football fields, stacked 20 containers high, moving nearly everything you own across an ocean for pennies per unit. A fleet flying your flag into ports on 6 continents. You picture yourself as the quiet titan behind global trade itself, the invisible hand moving the physical world's goods from factory to shelf. That's the fantasy. Here's the actual business hiding underneath it. An industry so brutally cyclical that the same shipping line can post the largest profits in its entire corporate history one year and post a genuine multi-billion-dollar loss the very next. An industry where a single ship blocking a single canal can rattle global trade for weeks, and where the fundamental economics have been so historically punishing that the industry's own veterans have a saying for it. That shipping is a business where you go bankrupt slowly, then all at once. Some shipping lines have consolidated their way into genuine, durable dominance over global trade lanes. Others have owned technically excellent, well-maintained fleets and still gone under, crushed by a freight rate collapse that had nothing to do with how well they ran their ships. By the end of this, you'll understand exactly why cargo shipping is one of the most brutally cyclical, capital-intensive, and structurally consolidated businesses in the entire global economy, what you're actually buying before the money makes sense. You need to understand that cargo shipping is not one business. It's several genuinely different businesses that all happen to involve large steel vessels crossing water. Container shipping, the business of moving standardized steel boxes packed with consumer goods, electronics, clothing, and virtually everything that fills a retail shelf, is the segment most people picture and the one this script focuses on primarily, since it's the segment that has consolidated most dramatically and where the economics are most instructive. Bulk shipping, moving unpackaged commodities like iron ore, coal, and grain in specialized vessels, operates under meaningfully different economics, tied directly to global industrial production and commodity cycles rather than consumer retail demand. Tanker shipping, moving crude oil and refined petroleum products, operates as its own distinct market entirely, with its own vessel types and its own rate cycles tied to global energy production and consumption. This script focuses on container shipping specifically because it's the segment that has undergone the most dramatic structural transformation over the past several decades, consolidating from dozens of meaningfully independent competitors into a small handful of global alliances that now control the overwhelming majority of global container capacity. Owning a container shipping line today effectively means owning a position within one of these massive global alliances, since the economics of running a competitive global container network, the vessel scale required, the port relationships needed, the terminal access across dozens of countries, have become so capital-intensive that a genuinely independent operator competing outside these alliance structures faces a nearly insurmountable structural disadvantage, a dynamic that explains why this industry, despite moving the physical goods underlying the entire global economy, is now effectively run by fewer companies than most people would guess. The cost of actually building the fleet price of entry into container shipping at any meaningful scale is genuinely staggering, and it starts with the ships themselves. According to shipbuilding costs data tracked by maritime industry publications like Lloyd's List and Alphaliner, a new ultra-large container vessel, the kind capable of carrying over 20,000 20-foot equivalent container units, the industry's standard unit of measurement, costs somewhere in the range of $150 million to $200 million to build at a modern shipyard, with the largest, most technologically advanced vessels pushing toward $250 million or more depending on fuel technology and environmental compliance features. A genuinely competitive global container shipping network requires dozens of these vessels deployed across multiple trade routes simultaneously, meaning a serious fleet investment runs into the billions of dollars before a single container has been loaded. Shipyard capacity itself represents a genuine structural constraint on this industry, since the specialized yards capable of building vessels at this scale concentrated in a small number of countries, primarily South Korea, China, and Japan. And ordering a new vessel today typically means waiting 2 to 4 years for a delivery slot given the substantial backlog these yards carry. A lead time that means shipping lines are perpetually betting on what global trade demand will look like years in the future when they place a new vessel order today. Port terminal investment represents another enormous capital category. Since a shipping line seeking genuine reliability and cost control at its busiest ports increasingly invests directly in terminal infrastructure, cranes, container yards, and automated handling systems, either through wholly owned terminals or joint ventures with port authorities, an investment that can run into the hundreds of millions of dollars per major terminal, but that provides genuine strategic control over loading and unloading efficiency at the ports that matter most to a line's core trade routes. Container equipment itself, the actual steel boxes that get loaded onto and off of vessels, represents a surprisingly significant ongoing capital cost given how simple the equipment appears. Since a major shipping line must maintain a fleet of hundreds of thousands to over 1 million containers positioned strategically around the world to meet demand, and container leasing and ownership costs, including the logistics of repositioning empty containers back to where they're actually needed. A chronic inefficiency in global trade given persistent import-export imbalances between major economies represents a substantial ongoing operating cost that most people never consider when picturing this industry, the bill that never stops operating. A container shipping fleet involves cost categories that dwarf almost any other transportation business by sheer scale. Fuel represents consistently one of the largest single operating costs, since a large container vessel burns thousands of tons of fuel on a single ocean crossing. And according to industry data on vessel operating economics, fuel alone can represent 30 to 50% of a vessel's total voyage operating cost depending on current fuel prices and vessel speed, a dynamic that has made fuel price volatility one of the single most consequential factors determining a shipping line's quarterly profitability, and one largely outside any individual line's control. This cost category has become considerably more complex over the past several years as the International Maritime Organization's sulfur emission regulations, implemented globally starting in 2020, forced the entire industry to either switch to more expensive low-sulfur fuel or invest in exhaust scrubber systems that allow continued use of cheaper heavy fuel oil. A multi-billion-dollar industry-wide compliance decision that meaningfully affected every major line's cost structure and capital allocation simultaneously. Port fees and canal transit charges represent a substantial and genuinely unpredictable cost category, since every major port charges docking, handling, and pilotage fees that vary considerably by port and by vessel size. And the two critical choke point canals, Suez and Panama, both charge substantial transit tolls that can run into hundreds of thousands of dollars for a single large vessel's passage, tolls that shipping lines have little choice but to pay given that the alternative, sailing around the Cape of Good Hope or Cape Horn, adds weeks to a voyage and considerably more fuel cost than the toll itself. Crew costs, while a smaller percentage of total operating cost than fuel, represent a genuinely global labor market with its own complexities. Since modern container vessels operate with surprisingly small crews, often 20 to 25 people, given the extensive automation of modern vessel operations, but those crew members require specialized maritime training, and international maritime labor regulations governing working hours, safety standards, and crew welfare have become considerably more stringent following well-publicized incidents of crew mistreatment and excessive working hours that drew regulatory and media attention over the past 2 decades. Vessel maintenance and periodic dry docking represents a substantial, unavoidable cost cycle, since every vessel requires comprehensive dry dock inspection and maintenance every 2.5 to 5 years, depending on vessel age and classification society requirements, a process that takes the vessel entirely out of revenue-generating service for several weeks while removing it from the fleet's available capacity. A scheduling and cost planning challenge that every shipping line has to manage across its entire fleet simultaneously. The alliance system, and why nobody competes alone anymore here. the structural fact that explains almost everything strange about how this industry is organized today. The overwhelming majority of global container shipping capacity now operates through one of three major vessel-sharing alliances. Arrangements where nominally competing shipping lines share vessel space, coordinate sailing schedules, and jointly operate specific trade routes, rather than each running fully independent networks. According to industry analysis tracked by Alphaliner and other maritime consultancies, these alliances collectively control a substantial majority of global container shipping capacity on the major east-west trade lanes connecting Asia, Europe, and North America, meaning the shipping industry, despite technically featuring a number of large, individually branded competing companies, actually behaves considerably more like a small number of coordinated networks than the freely competitive market the number of distinct company names would suggest. This alliance structure emerged specifically because operating a genuinely comprehensive global container network independently had become prohibitively expensive for any single company, requiring more vessels, more port calls, and more capital than even the largest individual carrier could efficiently deploy alone. And by pooling vessel capacity across member lines, an alliance can offer more frequent sailings and broader port coverage than any single member could provide independently, while each individual line still maintains its own separate sales, marketing, and customer relationship operations, competing with fellow alliance members for the same shipper's business even while literally sharing space on the same vessels. This dynamic has profound implications for anyone considering entering this industry today, since a genuinely independent operator outside these alliance structures faces a structural disadvantage in offering the frequency and geographic coverage that large shippers, the major retailers and manufacturers who represent the industry's most valuable customers, have come to expect, meaning meaningful new entry into the industry's core east-west trade lanes has become increasingly difficult regardless of how much capital a new entrant might be willing to deploy. A genuine structural moat protecting the alliance members that has only deepened over the past 2 decades of industry consolidation, the freight rate roller coaster. There's a single number that determines whether a shipping line has a spectacular year or a catastrophic one. It's the freight rate, the price charged to move a single container across a specific trade route. And understanding just how violently this number can swing is essential to understanding this entire industry. According to freight rate data tracked by indices like the Shanghai Containerized Freight Index and Drewry's World Container Index, rates on major trade lanes have historically swung by multiples of several 100% within a matter of months during periods of genuine supply-demand imbalance, a volatility almost unheard of in most other transportation or logistics businesses. The COVID-19 pandemic produced the single most dramatic illustration of this volatility in the industry's modern history. As global consumer demand for physical goods surged during pandemic-era lockdowns, even as port congestion and labor shortages severely constrained available vessel capacity, spot freight rates on major trans-Pacific routes rose from a typical pre-pandemic level of roughly $1,500 to $2,000 per 40-foot container to peaks exceeding $15,000 to $20,000 per container at the height of the 2021 congestion crisis, an increase of well over 500%, generating what industry analysts widely described as the most profitable period in the container shipping industry's entire history, with major carriers posting quarterly profits that dwarfed anything the industry had produced in decades of prior operation combined. But this same volatility cuts brutally in the other direction. As pandemic-era supply chain disruptions eased and new vessel capacity order during the boom years began arriving into a normalizing market, freight rates collapsed back toward, and in some periods below, pre-pandemic levels by 2023, and several major carriers that had posted record profits just 2 years earlier reported meaningfully reduced earnings or outright losses as rates fell faster than the industry's cost structure could adjust. This boom-to-bust pattern is not a one-time pandemic anomaly, it's a structural, recurring feature of this industry that has played out across multiple cycles throughout container shipping's modern history. driven by the fundamental mismatch between how quickly vessel capacity can be ordered and delivered, typically a multi-year process, and how quickly actual shipping demand can shift in response to broader economic conditions, meaning the industry chronically overbuilds capacity during boom periods based on demand levels that don't persist by the time that new capacity actually arrives into service. The volatility nobody wants to talk about by the structural freight rate cycle. Shipping carries several distinctive risks that make it genuinely unlike most other capital-intensive businesses. Geopolitical choke point risk represents a genuinely acute vulnerability given how much global trade flows through a small number of narrow maritime passages. And the most dramatic recent illustration came in March 2021, when the container vessel Ever Given ran aground and blocked the Suez Canal for 6 days. A single vessel's grounding that halted an estimated $9 billion a day in global trade and required a complex, multi-day salvage operation before the canal reopened, an incident that demonstrated with startling clarity just how much of global commerce depends on a small number of narrow waterways functioning without interruption. More recently, attacks on commercial vessels transiting the Red Sea and the approach to the Suez Canal have forced numerous major shipping lines to reroute vessels around the Cape of Good Hope entirely, adding roughly 10 to 14 days and considerably more fuel costs to voyages between Asia and Europe that would otherwise transit the Suez Canal, a rerouting that has meaningfully tightened effective global vessel capacity simply by making voyages longer, illustrating how a regional security crisis thousands of miles from any individual shipping line's headquarters can directly and substantially affect that line's operating costs and schedule reliability. Fuel price volatility, discussed earlier as a major cost category, also functions as a genuine risk factor independent of the freight rate cycle, since fuel and freight rates don't always move in tandem, meaning a shipping line can face the genuinely difficult combination of rising fuel costs occurring during a period of weak freight rates, compressing margins from both directions simultaneously. Overcapacity risk, the industry's chronic structural tendency to order too many new vessels during boom periods, represents perhaps the most self-inflicted of this industry's risks, since the multi-year lag between ordering a vessel and its delivery means the industry has repeatedly demonstrated an inability to calibrate new capacity orders to actual future demand, resulting in recurring periods where too many vessels chase too little cargo, driving freight rates down industry-wide regardless of how well any individual line manages its own specific operations, a dynamic that punishes disciplined and undisciplined operators alike whenever the broader industry collectively overbuilds. The real case study, Hanjin Shipping's collapsado. Understand how catastrophically this industry's cyclicality can end even a historically major player. Look at what happened to Hanjin Shipping, once South Korea's largest container shipping line and, at the time of its collapse, one of the largest container carriers in the entire world by capacity. Hanjin had expanded its fleet substantially during the industry's prior boom years, taking on significant debt to finance vessel orders and capacity expansion based on demand projections that seemed reasonable at the time those orders were placed years earlier. When global freight rates entered a severe, sustained downturn following a period of industry-wide overcapacity, driven by the same boom-bust ordering pattern that has recurred throughout the industry's history, Hanjin found itself unable to service its substantial debt load against a freight rate environment that had deteriorated far below the levels its capacity expansion had been financially modeled around. The company filed for bankruptcy protection in South Korea in August 2016, and the collapse triggered genuine chaos across global supply chains that illustrated just how disruptive a major carrier's failure can be to the broader logistics ecosystem. Hanjin vessels were denied entry to numerous ports around the world by terminal operators and port authorities concerned about the company's ability to pay docking and handling fees given its bankruptcy status, leaving dozens of fully loaded vessels carrying an estimated $14 billion worth of cargo stranded at sea or anchored offshore, unable to dock and unload, for weeks in some cases, as retailers and manufacturers around the world scrambled to determine the fate of goods trapped aboard ships that had essentially become stranded assets in international waters. The disruption was severe enough that it affected the availability of goods for major retailers during the critical pre-holiday shopping season that year, and it prompted a genuine reckoning across the broader shipping industry about counterparty risk, the previously underappreciated possibility that a major, historically stable carrier could fail suddenly enough to strand billions of dollars of customers' cargo mid-transit. A risk that has since led many major shippers to diversify their carrier relationships across multiple lines specifically to avoid over-concentrating cargo risk with any single carrier, regardless of that carrier's historical scale or reputation. Hanjin's collapse remains the clearest illustration in this industry's modern history of the core structural lesson at the center of shipping economics. Debt taken on to finance capacity expansion during a boom period becomes a genuinely existential reality the moment the industry's inevitable cyclical downturn arrives, and by the time that downturn is severe enough to threaten a major carrier's survival. The disruption doesn't stay contained within that single company. It ripples outward across the global supply chains that had come to depend on that carrier's reliability. To scenarios, let's build the honest math the way an actual owner has to run it. In the good scenario, you own a major container shipping line with genuine alliance membership providing broad global network coverage, a fleet with disciplined vessel ordering that avoided overcommitting to new capacity during the prior cycle's peak, and you're operating during a period of genuine supply-demand tightness. Whether from a temporary disruption like the pandemic-era congestion or a structural constraint like the Red Sea rerouting that has effectively reduced global available capacity. Freight rates on your core trade lanes run well above your operating cost per container, and your fleet, already built and largely depreciated from prior years, generates extraordinary operating margins during this tight capacity window, with major carriers during genuinely strong periods having reported operating margins exceeding 40 to 50% of revenue, figures that would be extraordinary in almost any other capital-intensive transportation business, and that reflect just how much operating leverage this industry carries once a vessel's substantial fixed costs are already covered by baseline volume. Across a genuinely strong multi-year window, a well-positioned carrier can generate profits sufficient to pay down significant fleet debt, return substantial capital to shareholders, and invest in next-generation, more fuel-efficient vessels, positioning the line advantageously for the industry's ongoing environmental compliance requirements. Now the harder scenario. Industry-wide overcapacity, driven by aggressive vessel ordering across the industry during the prior boom period, floods the market with new capacity, thus as demand normalizes from whatever temporary disruption had driven the previous rate spike. Freight rates collapse toward, or below, the industry's average operating cost per container, and your fleet, carrying meaningful debt taken on to finance vessel orders placed during the more optimistic prior period, faces a genuinely difficult multi-quarter stretch where revenue per voyage falls well below what your capital structure was financially modeled around. Fuel costs, largely outside your control, don't necessarily fall in tandem with freight rates, potentially compressing margins from both directions simultaneously, and a scheduled dry dock maintenance cycle removes a meaningful share of your fleet from revenue-generating service at exactly the moment you can least afford reduced capacity utilization. The gap between these two scenarios is a modest variance in a financial model. It's the difference between one of the most profitable capital-intensive businesses in the global economy and a genuinely existential threat to the company's survival, entirely dependent on a freight rate cycle that no individual carrier, however well managed, meaningfully controls. The real payoff, the difference between shipping lines that survive multiple decades of this industry's brutal cyclicality and those that collapse the way Hanjin did, comes down to a small number of disciplined choices that run directly counter to the instinct to expand aggressively during the industry's genuinely exhilarating boom periods, maintaining conservative debt levels relative to fleet value, specifically resisting the temptation to finance aggressive new vessel orders purely off the strength of a temporary rate spike that may not persist by the time those new vessels actually arrive years later. has proven again and again to be the single clearest differentiator between carriers that survive the industry's inevitable downturns intact and those that don't, precisely because the multi-year gap between ordering a vessel and its delivery means every capacity decision is fundamentally a bet on demand conditions that won't be knowable until years after the decision is made. Securing genuine alliance membership and the network scale it provides has become close to a structural necessity rather than merely a competitive advantage. Given how thoroughly the industry's core trade lanes have consolidated around the major alliance structures, meaning a carrier's strategic position within, or unfortunately outside, these alliances now matters as much as its individual fleet quality or operational excellence, and building genuine financial reserves during the industry's strong periods specifically to survive the downturns that inevitably follow, rather than distributing every dollar of boom period profit back to shareholders or reinvesting it entirely into further capacity expansion, represents the single most important lesson the industry's veterans have learned across repeated cycles of exactly the boom-to-bust pattern this entire script has described. The romance of the massive vessel, the global reach, the invisible hand moving the physical economy across oceans, is genuinely real, and the carriers that have built durable, multi-decade positions in this industry are the ones that treated the boom years as an opportunity to build the financial resilience needed to survive the bust that history has repeatedly shown always eventually follows, rather than treating each boom as evidence that the old cyclical pattern had finally, permanently ended. Which means the honest answer to whether owning a cargo shipping line can build genuine, lasting wealth is yes, unambiguously, for the disciplined operators who understand that this industry rewards patience and financial conservatism over aggressive expansion. But the graveyard of this industry is filled with technically excellent fleets, well run by genuinely competent operators, that simply ran out of capital at exactly the wrong moment in a cycle that, however long the current boom feels like it might last, has never yet failed to eventually turn. And subscribe Alma Discover for more videos. Thank you.